Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the roar of 50,000 voices rising like a living storm. Stone seats tremble, trumpets cry out. The sun burns down on white marble and blood-stained sand. Most people think they know what happened in the Roman Colosseum. Gladiators, lions, cheers, glory. But there is a story almost never told, a story buried under centuries of myth and silence. A story about women who did not walk into the arena by choice, who were dragged into it as prisoners, as punishment, as spectacle. This is not the Rome of movies and statues. This is the Rome that whispers in the dark. She does not know her name will be forgotten. She only knows the iron on her wrists is cold, and the tunnel smells of sweat, fear, and old death. The stone beneath her bare feet is damp. Somewhere above, the crowd is screaming for entertainment, and they do not care who provides it. She was once someone's daughter, someone's wife, someone's sister. Now she is a body owned by the state, a living thing meant to be broken in front of an audience that paid to watch her suffer. Ancient Rome loved order, law, and control, but it also loved punishment that could be seen. Romans believed fear was a tool, and the Colosseum was their loudest weapon. When criminals were sentenced, the worst punishments were not carried out quietly, they were staged. Executions were turned into performances, and among the condemned were women, captured rebels, enslaved foreigners, accused criminals, and those who had simply crossed the wrong powerful man. Some were taken during wars, dragged from distant lands Rome had conquered. Others were enslaved within the empire itself. Many were guilty of nothing more than existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Once labeled enemies of Rome, their fate was sealed. They were stripped of identity, stripped of dignity, and stripped of hope. The Colosseum was not just for gladiators. That is the lie history likes to tell because it is easier to digest. In reality, the arena was a stage for death in many forms. Criminals were executed at midday when the crowd was restless and hungry for shock. This was when female prisoners were often brought out. They were not trained fighters. They were not heroes. They were examples. Imagine the gates opening and a woman stepping into the blinding light. The noise hits her like a wall. People laugh, people point, some cheer, others shout insults. To them, she is not human. She is part of the show, no different from an animal released from a cage. Some women were forced to reenact myths. Roman executions were often theatrical. A condemned woman might be dressed as a tragic figure from legend, only to be killed in a way that mirrored the story. To the crowd, it was clever entertainment. To the woman, it was terror layered on humiliation. She died not only painfully, but publicly, mocked by applause. Other women faced damnatio ad bestias, death by beasts. Lions, leopards, bears. Animals starved to make them more aggressive. The Romans called it justice. The crowd called it thrilling. But think about the reality. A woman standing alone in the sand, unarmed, hearing the growl before she sees the animal, knowing there is no escape, knowing the crowd wants her to run because fear makes better entertainment. Not all deaths were quick. That was the point. The longer it lasted, the louder the cheers grew. And then there were the women forced to fight. Female gladiators existed, though they were rare. They were called gladiatrices, and while some may have volunteered seeking fame or freedom, prisoners did not get that choice. For captive women, being trained to fight was another form of cruelty. They were taught just enough to survive a little longer, just enough to make the fight interesting. Victory did not mean freedom. It meant you lived to suffer again. Training was brutal. Food was scarce. Injuries were common. Discipline was enforced with whips. These women were property, investments meant to generate profit through spectacle. Their bodies were pushed past exhaustion, past pain, past dignity. Scars became permanent reminders that their lives no longer belonged to them. When a female prisoner fought in the arena, the crowd reacted differently than they did to men. Curiosity mixed with cruelty. Some spectators were shocked, others were thrilled. Roman writers recorded fascination with women who fought, not because of their skill, but because it broke social norms. That shock value made the suffering even more profitable. And yet, these women were never meant to be remembered as warriors. Their stories were not carved into statues. Their names were not celebrated. Most were erased as soon as they died, their blood washed away so the sand could be used again the next day. What made the Colosseum especially terrifying was how final everything felt. Once a woman entered the underground chambers, there was no appeal, no mercy, no last-minute rescue. Roman law was absolute. If the sentence was death, the method was chosen to entertain. The crowd had power too. Their reactions mattered. If they were bored, the executioners made it worse. If they demanded blood, they got it. Thousands of eyes watched every movement, every stumble, every scream. Privacy did not exist. Fear was shared by one and enjoyed by many. Some women tried to resist. They refused to scream. They stood still, denying the crowd the pleasure of panic. Others broke down completely, collapsing before anything even touched them. Both reactions were judged. Both were mocked. There was no correct way to die in the Colosseum. Roman society justified this cruelty with stories. They said criminals deserved it. They said enemies of Rome were less than human. They said the games honored the gods. These explanations made violence easier to accept. When people believe suffering has a purpose, they stop questioning it.
But the truth is simpler and darker. The Colosseum existed because people wanted to watch others suffer. Female prisoners were included because their pain added something new, something shocking, something that kept audiences coming back.
Even Roman philosophers criticized the games, calling them corrupting and brutal. Yet they continued for centuries. That should tell you how powerful the hunger for spectacle really was. As Christianity slowly spread through the empire, attitudes began to shift. Executions still happened, but public enthusiasm faded. Female gladiators were eventually banned. The Colosseum's roar grew quieter. But silence does not erase what happened there. Today, tourists walk through the ruins taking photos. They imagine brave gladiators saluting the emperor. They rarely imagine a terrified woman standing alone in the sand, surrounded by laughter, knowing she will not see another sunset. History often chooses which voices to amplify. Kings, generals, champions. The women who died in the Colosseum left no memoirs, no monuments. Their only trace is in scattered records, brief mentions, and the uncomfortable gaps in what Rome preferred to remember. But if you listen closely, the stones still speak. They remember the fear. They remember the screams swallowed by applause. They remember women who were turned into warnings, into entertainment, into nothing. The dark reality is this. The Colosseum was not just a symbol of Roman greatness. It was a machine built to destroy lives publicly, efficiently, and repeatedly. Female prisoners were not an exception to its cruelty. They were proof of how far a society will go when violence becomes normal and empathy becomes inconvenient. And the most disturbing part is not that it happened long ago. It is how easily it was accepted, how quickly crowds learned to cheer, how smoothly horror blended into everyday life. So the next time you see an image of the Colosseum standing proud against the Roman sky, remember what is missing from the picture. Remember the women whose names we will never know. Remember that history's darkest truths are often hidden behind its most famous monuments. Because once you know this story, you can never look at that arena the same way again.